This is the setup and buyer's guide for the bass guitar. Now the bass guitar, the electric bass guitar, which is the one that I'm holding, is a fairly recent addition to the musical instrument family. Up until the 1950s, basses were always played as what were called double basses or upright bass that you may have seen in classical music or in jazz. And then when rock and roll came along, there became a need to have the bass be louder and be played in different venues, bigger venues, and have amplification attached to it. And the Fender Musical Instrument Company came up with the precision bass in the 1950s, which was the same format of strings, but instead of being played upright, it was played like a guitar, which is why it's called the electric bass guitar. Now, the most common format for the electric bass guitar is 4 strings, which is what this one is. However, there are 5 string, 6 string, 7 string, all the way up, so even all the way up to like a 12-string electric bass guitar. But for now, the most common one is a 4-string electric bass guitar. So the strings on an electric bass guitar are the same as the 4 largest strings on a regular guitar, which are E, A, D, and G. A question I get asked a lot by my students is, should I rent a bass or an amplifier before I buy it? And my recommendation is, if you live in a large urban area or close to a place where there are music stores that do rental programs, definitely go ahead and rent something before you buy it. The price for a rental is usually very low, sometimes as little as $7 or $10 for a single day. And if you want to try it out for a whole month, usually there's about a $30 charge. And if you're planning on spending hundreds of dollars, I often think it's just a good idea, if you can try it out, even just for a day, get it home, really try it out in your own environment, because trying out things in a music store can be very challenging, especially if you're there on a Saturday when it's really busy and there's lots of people trying different things. It can be hard to hear really clearly what's going on with the amplifier or bass that you're trying out. Now, when you're getting into playing the electric bass, the good news is that the price point at the bottom is very low. And there are lots of packages now that are offered where you can get an electric bass guitar with a practice amplifier, cables, a tuner, everything you need to get started playing for a very low price. Sometimes between $200 and $500 you can get all of that in one package, which I recommend if you're just getting started. When you get above that in price point, you can get to things like this bass, which is made by Fender's lower end company, which is called Squier. And this is a remake of a very famous bass called a jazz bass. And this guitar was about $400. And it's a little bit, it's a little bit nicer finish and a little bit better pickups than the cheapest end. But it didn't come with an amplifier or cables, so that price just included the bass itself. On any electric instrument, most of what's generating the sound is coming from the actual pickups, which you can change out on a bass. So you can start with a very low-end bass and decide that you want to upgrade the sound of it just by changing out the pickups. Now, the controls for the bass guitar are slightly different on each guitar. On this one, there are 2 separate volume knobs which control the front pickup and the back pickup, so you can blend how much of each one is coming through the signal, and then a master tone knob, which is controlling how much bass or treble is coming through the signal. On a lot of other basses, it's the opposite. There'll be 1 volume knob that's controlling everything and 2 tone knobs which are giving you a bit more of a blend. And then you have the actual instrument input, which is here, which connects the cable to the amplifier. In a very general sense, where money is saved when you're buying a cheaper instrument is on things like the machine heads. The metal will be cheaper and less durable on a lower end instrument, and more secure on a higher end instrument, as well as the pickups itself. There are 2 main types of bass amplifiers. They're tube amps and solid state. Originally, when basses first became electric, tube amps were the only kind of amps there were. So a lot of people will tell you the only real pure great sound on a bass comes from a tube amp. However, it's a little bit of personal choice, and also there's some other factors. With tube amps, they're quite heavy and they're also very expensive. And they don't have features like having a headphone be able to plug into it, and sometimes some extra effects. So for beginner and intermediate, I definitely recommend going with a solid state amplifier first. One other factor you want to think about is the kind of speaker you have in your cabinet. These are 10-inch speakers, there's 2 of them. Sometimes with bass amps, especially older cabinets, you'll get one large 15-inch speaker, which will give you more low end but less high end. As a very general rule, the bigger the speaker, the more bassy and bottomy it is, and the smaller the speaker, the more high end you'll get. To get a basic practice amplifier that's solid state is going to start at around $500 and go up from there. And in the $500 price point, you're going to be looking at somewhere between 40 and 100 watts. Then the next step up from there is in the sort of $600 to $1,000 range. You're going to get more speakers in the cabinets and more wattage, so you might get up to 400, 350 watts in that range. And then above $1,000, you're getting into large amplifiers, so that are 800 to 1,000 watts. How we measure the volume of an amplifier is in wattage. This can be a little confusing because the wattage in a guitar amp and a bass amp are not really the same thing. This amplifier here is 80 watts, which is for guitar, and this amplifier is 150 watts. But the guitar amp is actually quite a bit louder. And this just has to do with how sound travels and low frequencies. For just practicing at home, 40 watts for a small practice amp is lots of volume. When you get into playing and jamming with friends, and especially with drummers and guitar players, I recommend getting 150 to 200 watts. This will just give you enough volume that you feel like you can keep up sound-wise with the other instruments in your group. Whether you're getting tube or solid state, there's also one other factor to consider, which is whether you get a combo amp, which is like what this is, where the speaker cabinet and the amplifier is all in one unit with a handle, or you get a cabinet which is separate from the bass head. Now, they both have pros and cons. With a combo, everything is always all hooked up and you just have to grab it and go. The upside of a head and cabinet is that if you, for example, have a regular rehearsal time with your friends at someone else's house or a garage, the cabinet is the heaviest part of the amp. And if you don't want to be lugging it back and forth, you can just leave the cabinet where you rehearse and just grab the head, which only weighs about 5 pounds, and stick it in your gig bag, and away you go. And when you get home, you can plug headphones into the bass head or even plug it out into a very small basic sound system. Now, when it comes to a strap and strap locks, I highly recommend getting some kind of a strap locking system. And all that is, I've actually used just a very simple rubber casing around it. The reason is that, especially on the electric bass, which is a very heavy instrument, when you first get a strap, it'll fit very snugly around the cleats, but over time it'll get worn out and it'll pop off eventually. And because the instrument's so heavy, if it popped off and it dropped and hit the floor or banged into something, it would crack the finish or damage the neck. So having some way of actually keeping the strap in place is really important. And you can buy strap locking systems for very inexpensive and have them installed at a guitar store. A really important piece of equipment that's often overlooked is a good guitar stand. When you're playing the bass, you'll unfortunately often see people with their guitars or basses just resting it against an amplifier or a table like this or like this. I do not recommend this at all. A bass is a really heavy instrument, and if it slides over and knocks down onto the floor, it's going to get damaged really easily just because of how heavy it is. And a good guitar stand will only cost you somewhere between $20 and $50. And guitar stands and bass stands are interchangeable, and you can fold them up and take them with you wherever you go. The other reason I recommend them is that it's going to make practicing and working on your music a lot easier. It's an old saying that something that's out of sight is out of mind. And if you're packing up your instrument and putting it in a case and sticking it in a closet every time you're done, it's another barrier to go and get it out of the case and get playing again. Whereas if it's just sitting on a stand, you might walk by and think, oh, I'm waiting for somebody, I got 5 minutes, I'll just pick it up and play a little bit. On the electric bass guitar, there's two main types of strings. There are regular strings, and then there are what are called flat wounds. And flat wound strings will give you more of the classic rock kind of sound. They're a little bit darker and thumpier. And regular bass guitar strings will give you a little bit of more of a bright sound, a little more of a poppy R&B kind of sound. I personally like just regular bass strings because I find that with most amplifiers I can adjust the tone on the amplifier to give me more of the flat wound sound if I'm looking for that, and then I always can go back the other way and have more of a pop and R&B sound if I want it. Whereas if you have flat wounds on your bass, they're always going to sound like flat wounds. So only if you're only committed to that sound are they kind of a good option. Now, connecting your bass to the bass amplifier is going to be done using an instrument cable. And these are also commonly called 1/4 inch cables. So they have a 1/4 inch input. They most commonly will come with both ends straight like this. Now, if you have a bass that has an input that's on the front, or especially if it's on the bottom of the body, I really recommend getting what's called a right angle cable, which will have one side look like this. Now, the reason is that if you plug in a straight cable into the body like this, it becomes a bit of a potential danger that things can bang into this and potentially snap the cable right off in the input. Whereas if you have a right angle cable into the actual instrument, it's a little bit more flush with the body. The other thing is if you run your cable up under your strap and around like this, it sort of tucks neatly behind, and if the cable ever gets pulled really hard, like you step on it, you get a little bit of support here from the end pin, so it's not going to rip the cable right out. Now, connecting the other end to the amplifier is very simple. It just goes right into the front end that says input on the amplifier. And now let's have a closer look at the front end controls on the bass head as well as the back. So here we have the front end of the head for the Fender Rumble 150. So this is a 150 watt bass head that connects to a passive cabinet. Now, all heads work basically the same way. I'll just show you some of the basic features on this. So we have our input, which is where the instrument cable goes in. Then there's a switch to lower the overall volume of the amp. This is a really great feature if you want to keep your amp settings in a certain way and just be able to play quiet or practice quieter. You can just do it with one click of the switch. Then we have a volume knob, and again, with all electric instruments, you want to make sure that this is down at 0 or very low when you plug in any instrument to an amplifier so you don't get surprised by a big loud sound. Then moving over, we have an overdrive section. This is a little unique for an amp this size, but we have a overdrive which is we can push in and it'll come on, and we have a gain, which is how much distortion you get, and then a blend, which gives how much is actually going into the main signal. Then moving on, we get into the equalization section. This amp has a really great feature for a push button EQ. So this is labeled punch, so this will give you more of a R&B or slap kind of sound on the bass with just one push of a button. The one next to it is a scoop, which gives you more of a classic rock, big low bottom end sound. And what's great about that is even within a song or between songs, if you want to just quickly get a different sound, you can just do it with one push of a button. Then the actual EQ on the amp has bass, low mid, mid high, and treble. And these are the settings that allow you to really get your specific sound on your bass. Now, every room is going to sound a little bit different, and every bass you plug into your amp is going to sound a little bit different. So I really encourage people to try it out, play around with it, kind of find the right sound for your setup. And then finally, all the way over on the other side is the power switch. Let's check out what happens on the back. Here we have the back of the bass head. There are many different inputs on it, but there are only a couple of things that you really need to know about first. One is where the power cable goes in. And on most modern amplifiers like this, the power cables are all exactly the same as what you'd see on a desktop computer or a monitor. The next thing you have to know about is how to connect the head to the cabinet. And this is an important thing. These little lightning bolts are telling you that these are powered outputs, which means that there is actual electrical current being transmitted through the speaker cable and into the cabinet to give it power. The reason you got to be careful is that you want to make sure you're only using a speaker cable and that whatever this is plugging into is passive. And the way to know that it's passive is the cabinet has nothing else that's powering it. It doesn't have a power cable like this. It has two of these because we can power more than one cabinet at a time. Either one will do. If you're plugging into one cabinet, you only need to, it doesn't matter which one of these you plug into. Over here we have an effects send return loop. This is a bit more of an advanced function that allows you to send your bass signal out to be processed and then back into the amplifier, which you might use for something like reverb or delay or some kind of compression. Next to it is a nice feature for some of these smaller amps, which is an auxiliary in. These are RCA cables, which make it easy to connect to something like a smartphone or a tablet or a TV if you want to send a signal of audio that you're practicing along with. This allows you to put it into the amplifier so you'll hear it out of the same speakers. Then next to that, you get your headphone input, and the headphone input on this particular one does not sever the connection with the cabinet. So if you want to only have the headphones, you have to unplug the speaker cable. Then there's a foot switch which controls the overdrive, which we saw on the front of the amp. And this simply will switch it on and off. You have to buy a foot switch for that. And then on the far right, we have the line out. And this allows you to plug a microphone cable into a sound system. And it has a ground lift, which is something that's important to help take away some of the buzz or hum that you might find. On the back of the bass cabinet, there's only a couple things you have to know about. The main thing is where to put the other end of that speaker cable. So there are two inputs for the speaker cable. It doesn't matter which one you have. This also allows you to plug one into here and then also come out of the speaker cabinet potentially into another one. Again, it's a much more advanced feature. This also has these two inputs which are called speak-on cables, and these are newer, more modern ways to connect a head to a cabinet. Some heads will have this option, some won't. Just this cabinet gives you both. A common question I get asked about bass playing is, should I be playing with my fingers or slapping, or should I be using some kind of either guitar pick or bass pick? It somewhat comes down to personal preference, but the common sounds you hear most often played on the electric bass guitar are played with your fingers. And the usual technique is alternating between your pointer finger and your middle finger, which allows you, if you're just using a single finger, there's a limit to how fast you can do a single stroke. Whereas if you have alternating fingers on multiple strings, it allows you to move back and forth a little more comfortably and cleanly. The pick really changes the sound of the strings, and it makes it a little more clicky and clunky sounding. I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way, but it just has a little bit more of a clack, 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 clack sound. I tend to only use a pick playing the bass if I'm playing rock, where I have to play a lot of really fast back and forth for a long time, like it can be very hard to keep that going with just the fingers if you're playing a song that's 5 minutes long.